So ever since Israel was established in 1948, it had 15 prime ministers. They were all Zionist. They were all Ashkenazis. They were all in favor of a Jewish state, but they were never, ever able to make peace with the Palestinians. In fact, not only did they not make peace with the Palestinians, they made many wars with thousands of people have been killed, and on both sides, the Israeli and the Palestinian side, and thousands have been injured, many very severely, not to mention the monetary cost and the cost to property and many other aspects, negative aspects of the war. So you ask yourself, why are they not able to make peace? 15 prime ministers. They all claim to want peace. I think it was Golda Meir who said, when the Palestinians stop teaching their children to hate Israelis, there will be peace. But many of those prime ministers repeated the same statement. And on the Palestinian side, when you ask them the same question, why were you not able to make peace with the Israelis? And they would tell you many other reasons, but one of the reasons is that the Israelis do not teach tolerance towards Palestinians. And when they stop teaching hatred, there will be peace. See, it doesn't work that way. Peace is not made by blaming each other. It cannot. Because one of the problems that I see is that the Israelis and the Palestinians see themselves as different entities. And they see themselves as one group against the other. They do not see themselves as one group. They both competing to possess the land, but there is no really a definition of what does it mean. What does it mean when the land is yours? So it's a very inaccurate war over land, and the element of people is not being considered almost at all. In Israel-Palestine, for the governments, on both sides, land is more important than people. And I think that in order to make peace, you need to switch this around. People should always be more important than peace. People are more important than ideology. People are more important than religion, than identity. Definitely more important than war. And those governments, all 15 prime ministers up to now, and the Palestinian, but the Palestinian on my side are really reacting to Israel. They are not the main actors. They are reacting. All consider land more important than people, and they have no problem going into violence again and again and again. And bottom line, today, October 24, 2020, 72 years after the State of Israel has been established, there is no peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And we have to find a new way to make peace, because peace is more important than anything else. Lives is more important than anything else. And these governments do not treat lives as an important element in for their existence, for the government's existence. So I would like to talk about my vision of peace, because I think that my vision of peace makes a lot of sense. I wrote about it many, many times. I wrote a book about it. I had a movie that discussed it called Surviving Peace. And I also do simulations about it on a regular basis. I am proving that peace is possible. By the way, the next simulation is going to be on November 5th, 2020 at 7 p.m. Los Angeles time. You can call me, you can email me. You can email me. My name is Joseph Avasar, and email me at josephavassar@ipconfederation.org. And I will send you a Zoom invitation to participate in the simulation. And I will prove to you that my vision, my formula for peace works. And it not only makes peace, peace is the tip of the iceberg. It also brings vision, prosperity for the Israelis and the Palestinian people together. And it doesn't remove, I know I sound like a commercial for vitamins, but it's true. It's true. I'm not charging you a penny for it. I'm not. I am just showing it to you for free. You don't need to buy my vitamins. You don't need to buy my bicycle. You don't need, all you need to do is listen to what I am about to say and participate in the simulation on Zoom on November 5th. I'm not selling you anything. So, in order to make peace, you have to first understand that the Israeli government and the Palestinian government, no matter how much you like these governments and how much you think they're good people, you'll have to admit that as of today, for the last 72 years, they haven't been able to make peace, period. That's the underlying fact. You cannot refute that fact. So since they failed, if you had a plumber coming to your house for 72 years, failing to fix the leak in your bathroom, at least you would say, let me get another plumber. So what I am proposing is keep the Israeli government and all its institutions, including the army, including the military, including the police, the tax authorities, everything. You don't touch, you don't dismantle the Israeli government. The same with the Palestinian governments, including Hamas. They maintain all of their institutions, their government, their legislative branch, their military branch. You keep them all. Because why? You just cannot dismantle those governments, the Israeli, the Palestinian. They're too strong. They're too entrenched. They have a lot of support. They have military power. They have support from their own people. They basically were able to show is the wrong word. They were able to sell the idea to their people that they are necessary to protect them. So you cannot get rid of those governments. Because in theory, one government for the whole area, secular government, one person, one vote makes a lot of sense. But we have three governments that we have to deal with. And they're not, you cannot dismantle them. That's why the idea of one state, even though in theory it makes sense, in reality of Israel-Palestine today doesn't make sense. It's not a good idea. And I'm not against one state. But it's not practical, in my opinion. But if you think you can create one state, all the power to you. I'm not against it, but I don't think you can ever formulate a plan that would make sense to dismantle the Israeli government, the Hamas government, and the Palestinian government. So you have to deal with reality. And the reality is that those governments exist. They're not going away. In fact, they're becoming stronger. Just like a doctor has to deal with the patient not the way he wished him to be. A doctor can't tell his patient, come back when you are healthy and then it's be easier for me to take care of you. Come back when you lose 250 pounds. It doesn't work. Doctor has to, some of you are doctors, a doctor has to deal with the patient the way he is, not the way he wished him to be. So when we want to make peace, if we really want to make peace, and I know that, in my opinion, a lot of Israelis, a lot of Palestinians do not want to make peace. The majority, including their governments, do not want to make peace, but they are being irresponsible. They are being irresponsible. They are being arrogant, thinking that no peace is necessary. They much rather, on both sides, the Israeli and the Palestinian side, they much rather hope for victory than peace. Peace is difficult. It's a relationship. You need to work on it. It's much easier to be enemies. And you just say bad things. You don't have to deal with reality. You have to deal with what you know, which is war, which is you're already used to it. So peace is hard work. There is no question about it. But it's the only possible solution. When you speak to people, even those who secretly do not want peace, and you say, are you for peace? They all say yes, of course, because they know that eventually peace is the only solution. It's the only responsible thing to have. So I say, keep those governments. You cannot touch them, you cannot dismantle them. But create a new government for the people of Israel and Palestine together. A government that would exist side by side, the Israeli government and the Palestinian government. The whole area has 14 million people in Israel, in Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem. 9 million Israelis, 5 million Palestinians. Total of 14 million people. They don't have a single government. There is a government for the 9 million Israelis, and there are two governments for the 5 million Palestinians, the PA and Hamas. So you need to create a government for the whole area. And look, it makes perfect sense. Everyone on the ship should have one government. There may be some people on the ship that favor one side or another, but the ship has to have a certain direction. You cannot have two captains on the ship fighting each other where the ship would go. You need to have a ship for the whole area. So I'm saying let's have a government for the 14 million people. So you say to yourself, Joseph, how are you going to create a government for the 14 million people? And who is going to allow you to do that? And let me respond to the second question, which that is probably more on your mind. Who is going to allow the people of Israel and Palestine to do that? Does it have to be a permission? Do you need to get a permission slip to create a common government? A permission slip from whom? From the Israeli government or the Palestinian government? We, the Israeli and the Palestinian people, are independent people. We do not need, and no one should require us to have permission to have governments that would represent us. See, the governments represent the people. It's not the other way around. So as long as it's legal, as long as it is viable, and as long as it doesn't undermine the existing legitimate governments, you don't need permission. Now, the Israeli government and the Palestinian governments and the Hamas government are going to be upset. They don't want, nobody wants competition, including governments. Not only competition with governments, but a competition that would embarrass them. But legally, practically, legitimately, neither the Israeli nor the Palestinian nor governments could prevent that from happening. The people of Israel and Palestine, do not need permission to create such a government. So, and by the way, not only do they not need permission, in reality, the Israeli government and the Palestinian government should praise the existence of a new government. I know they're not going to praise it, but they should. They should say, you know what? We haven't been able to give you peace and anything for peace. And they do say, we will turn every rock for peace. So they should be supporting a common government for peace. And they don't have the legal authority or the moral authority or the technical ability to prevent the people of Israel, the 14 million, the people of Israel and Palestine, to create a common government. And the common government makes a lot of sense because even if they didn't have wars, because they lived together, they need to have a common government to help them move into the future. Even if they didn't have hostility, you would want a common government. So now the next question is, how do you create a common government? How do you create it? And that's very, very simple. The 14 million people, you divide into, you create a government that has a democracy, a secular democracy that has a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch made out of Israelis and Palestinians that would treat everyone with equality. It would be secular, not religious, not Jewish, not Islamic, or no other religion, not Christian of any. It would be a secular government that would focus on peace and prosperity for the people of Israel and Palestine. So you take the whole area of 14 million people and you divide the 14 million people into 300 parliamentary districts or congressional districts. So if you divide 14 million by 300, you'll get approximately 47,000 people per district. And that district will each have a parliament member. And that's very, very significant because we will elect 300 parliament members for Israel and Palestine. It could be Palestinians. Some district will be exclusively Palestinians. Some district will be exclusively Israelis. And some district will be both. But they will each elect one person. In those districts that are mixed district, a Palestinian could vote for an Israeli, or an Israeli could vote for a Palestinian, whoever they feel would bring more prosperity to that district, more peace to that district, whoever they feel is more honest. But it's important to have the districts, and it's important to have parliament members in those districts. And I'll tell you why. Because when you do that, you remove nationalism from the total formula. Each district is represented by a person, by a parliament member. That parliament member is not responsible for the entire people of Israel or the entire people of Palestine. He or she is responsible for their districts and their districts only because they were elected by that district. They ran in that district. They proposed their agenda in that district. They will have an office in that district. The people of that district can go to them and say, these are my problems and we want you to help us solve them. It's not about the entire conflict. And that would make it much easier for the parliament members to reach agreements between them because they are, a person from district number 57 will have or may have the same interest as a person from District 198, for example. Regardless if he is Palestinian or Israelis, they will work based on interest of their districts, not based on nationality. But it's important to have nationality as well in order to make sure that no one side can, that the public will trust it, that no one side can run roughshod over the others. So you have 300 parliament districts and 300 parliament members. And you will, in order for them, according to their constitution, by the way, you could read the constitution in full with every detail on www.ipconfederation.org. IP stands for Israeli Palestinian Confederation.org. It's in 3 languages, Arabic, Hebrew, and English. You could read the Constitution and you could read the frequently asked questions that explains how this thing could come about. So you create the 300 districts, and then you have an election. The election will have 2 ballots. 1 ballot for each district to elect the parliament members. So there could be 10, 20 parliament members running, or candidates, 10, 20 candidates for each district running. And you will have another ballot for president. And so now I'll talk about the executive branch, the president. Whoever gets the most number of votes in a nationwide election, 14 million people, will be the president, regardless of he's Israeli or Palestinian. And whoever gets the second number of votes of the other nationality will be vice president. And they will run the executive branch of the government. The branch that has to actually perform whatever the legislator passed, whatever laws the legislator passed. But the president, let's say the president elected would be Israeli, vice president is Palestinian. They will rotate after 2 years. And they will each have specific, important constitutional duties while they are running. It's not like the vice president is a figurehead. No, they will both have important functions to run the government. And you can read all of that in the Constitution. And then you will have a judicial branch, the branch of the judges of the Supreme Court. And remember, we are not replacing the Israeli judges or the Israeli government, but creating a common government, a common judicial branch, Israelis and Palestinians together. And that branch, the judges, would only be able to deal with issues relating to the laws that the parliament, the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation common government, passed. And in order to make sure that it's fair, so it's not going to be against Palestinians or against Israelis. So in order, according to the Constitution, you would need a majority of judges of whoever is being decided against or upon. So let's say there is a trial and it involves a Palestinian person. In order to find that Palestinian person liable or guilty, whatever the type of trial involves, in order to find against him, there'll have to be a majority judges that are Palestinians. In other words, you cannot have majority Israeli judges against a Palestinian. And the same thing with Israeli. In order to find against an Israeli person, you will have to have a majority Israeli judges. And on top of that, the Constitution gives both sides, whoever the judges decided against, the right to appeal to his own system, to his own. So Israeli could appeal the decision to an Israeli court, Palestinian could appeal the decision to a Palestinian court. So let me go back to the parliament, the legislative branch. How would that parliament pass laws? In order for the parliament to pass laws, because you're going to tell me, Joseph, there aren't going to be equal number of Palestinian or Israeli judges, parliament members, I'm sorry. And I say, yes, of course, there aren't going to be equal numbers. So you say, well, then that's it. It's not going to be fair. No. According to the Constitution, in order for the parliament to pass laws, you would need 55%, and that's what we do in the simulation, by the way, 55% of the Palestinian parliament members to vote yes on the proposed legislation, on the proposed laws, and you would need 55% of the Israeli parliament members to vote yes on the proposed legislation, on the proposed laws. So, for example, let's say, assuming there will be, of the 300 parliament members, 180 Israeli parliament members have been elected. That's reasonable because there is more Israeli population. It's a larger population. And 120 Palestinian parliament members. So in order to pass laws, you would need 55% of the 120 Palestinian parliament members to vote yes, and you will need 55% of the 180 Israeli parliament members to vote yes on the legislation. Now, once they pass the legislation, that's not the end of the story, because remember, we have an Israeli government, a Palestinian government, a Hamas government, and they feel that they are in control, and rightly so. They have the power, they have the military power, they have everything. So, what do you do with them? Basically, what you say is, according to the Constitution, is you say to them, not only say, you offer them the right, the ability to veto the legislation. You go to the Israeli and the Palestinian governments and you say, hey, we, the government of the entire area, we passed legislation. And we think this legislation is good for peace, it's good for the people of Israel, it's good for the people of Palestine, it's fair. We already debated it, we got 55% on each side to vote for it. But guess what? We are giving you a veto power over the legislation. If you pass the legislation, if you veto the legislation, it's not going to pass. But if you do not veto, then it's going to pass. And it's going to be the law of the land of the entire area, Israel, West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, because we are also a legitimate government. We were elected by the people of Israel and Palestine. Our legitimacy it comes from the people, just like any other democracy. And we will be able to enforce that legislation. So, again, you say to me, well, Joseph, they're going to veto everything, either the Israeli or the Palestinian governments. And let me get a cup of water and I'll respond to that. Okay, I'm back. So you say, Joseph, they're going to veto everything. The Israeli and the Palestinian governments are enemies of each other. They'll veto everything. Not so fast. Because the common government, the common parliament, will be able to come up with legislation that is acceptable to both sides, that would only be beneficial to both sides, because both sides you need both sides to pass the legislation. You cannot just have one side, you have to have both sides. So the legislation that the common parliament passed, almost by definition, is a good legislation that is good for both sides. Now, the Israeli government may have a different perspective. The Palestinian government may have a different perspective, possibly. But they are given the opportunity to veto the legislation. And they will have to explain to their people, to their media, to the whole world, why is it that they refused reasonable legislation that comes from their own people, the Israeli and Palestinian people together. They'll have to explain the legitimate reason why they vetoed the legislation. So, you see, the idea is that they would not be able to veto legislation because every government, no matter what, even kings, need to have legitimacy from their people. If their people feel that their government is not doing what's necessary for them, their people are not going to be happy and they're not going to support that government. And every government in the world knows that they need support from their people. They need legitimacy. At least a perceived legitimacy. They need to claim that they have legitimacy, that they have a real reason to veto the legislation. So the common parliament members, and that's what we do in the simulation. You can join me on November 5th at 7 p.m. Los Angeles time. Again, this is my email, josephavisar@ipconfederation.org. And you'll see, we actually have, in the simulation, we simulate the existing reality. We simulate an Israeli parliament member, as Israeli prime minister, a Palestinian Hamas leader, a PA leader. We simulate, we ask people to take part in becoming Israeli parliament members, Palestinian parliament members. We also simulate President of the United States, Chancellor of Germany. Sometimes, depending on the number of people we have, a Russian president, EU, and very important is a World Bank president to help us with their expertise. The World Bank has a lot of expertise on how to create governments and how to run governments, and to have financial support, of course. So you ask me, well, okay, Joseph, what kind of legislation could the parliament pass that the Israeli government and the Palestinian government would not be able to veto? And that's what we do in the simulation. But let me give you an example. If you remember, we asked the Israeli and the Palestinian parliament, why is there no peace? And they blame each other because their governments teach hatred towards each other. So let's assume that the parliament, the common parliament, passed legislation that requires the educational system on each side to teach tolerance towards each other, that requires them to teach the history of each other, that requires them to not only teach it in school, but also in the public media, and to have books that would be created together by a joint committee to teach tolerance and history and acceptability of each other, to exchange students, to exchange teachers and professors, to have Palestinian teachers and professors come to Israeli schools, and to have Israeli teachers and professors go to Palestinian schools, to answer questions, to present the history. Neither the Israeli nor the Palestinian governments would have the legitimacy to veto that legislation, because if they veto it, they will have to explain to their people, why are they vetoing it? How does it make sense? They're asking their people to go and die in wars because there is hatred, and now here's a legislation to stop hatred, and your government is going to veto this legislation? Well, your government is not going to get legitimacy. It's not going to be able to send its young people to war, to fight each other. So, and we simulate all of that, and we show that they don't veto the legislation. They all say, well, we're not going to veto it. And there is another thing. They are too embarrassed to veto. It's not possible for them to veto. They're also going to get world pressure, not just from their own people, but from the whole world. Pressure not to veto the legislation. Now, there are many, many, many types of legislations that the common government, the parliament, could pass. For example, to create a joint economic zone between Gaza and Israel, to have a joint airport, a joint seaport, universities, agriculture, high tech, low tech, to have a common passport, and I'll talk about the common passport as well. See, it's not going to be run by the Israeli government, it's not going to be run by the Palestinian government or by Hamas government. It's going to be run by the joint government, the common government, with distinct uniform, with their own command system that involves the president, the vice president, and officers, Israelis and Palestinian people together. It's just kind of like, when they both drive a car and they switch drivers, but they both have control over the gas, the brakes, and the clutch, if it's a stick shift. So you create a system where they are dependent on each other for their existence, and they create and dependent on each other for their future, for their vision. And little by little, you create trust. So now you ask me, and by the way, okay, now you ask me, how are you going to have this election? Physically. Well, I know it's very easy to have the election because we created that election. We had it on December 12, 2012. We divided the whole area into 300 districts. We had people run for parliament. We had people run for president, except that we didn't really have the ability, the notoriety, the advertising to advertise it. So 99.99% of the Israelis and the Palestinians didn't know about it. We were hoping that the election by itself will create a buzz and will bring Israelis and Palestinians, but that wasn't enough. In order to have this common government together and to have the election, it needs resources, it needs substantial planning, it needs a lot of people behind it. Not so much. I mean, Israel and the Israelis and the Palestinians are spending billions and billions of dollars on war, on military hardware, on airplanes, on missiles. We are talking about a fraction of that cost in terms of creating a foundation to create for this kind of election. But the election themselves could take place on the internet. Right now we have fingerprint ability to identify fingerprints, facial recognition, and location recognition. So we can have Israelis and Palestinians. We know what districts they belong to. We have the ability to know what districts they belong to. And so we can have the election over the internet very, very easily. So then you say to me, Joseph, how many people are going to vote in this election? And that's really the main issue, how many people? Because if there aren't enough people voting in this election, then the government does not have legitimacy. You need to have legitimacy. And in order to have legitimacy, you need to have a lot of people voting, because the people own the government. It's not the other way around. So, and where are you going to get those people? Look, I am assuming that 80% of the Israeli and the Palestinian people would be against this. I'm already assuming that. I'm not here to convince the 80% that they should vote, although I think that eventually they will. But I also believe, based on the presentations that I make time and time again, that at least 20% of the Israelis and 20% of the Palestinians would participate in the election. At least, if not more. Why? Why would they participate? Because a lot of Israelis and a lot of Palestinians understand that this conflict is not going to have a victory. These are mamas and papas living, and children living next to each other. It's not tanks fighting each other. It's not airplanes dogfighting each other. It's not about missiles. It's about people. The people, we Israelis and Palestinians live together, right next to each other. There is not going to be a victory. The Palestinians will not be able to have 9 million Israelis leave the area. The Israelis will not be able to have the 5 million Palestinians leave the area. It's just unrealistic. And those people, the 20%, understand that. They realize it. They not only that, they realize that their governments failed them. And their governments are not going to be able to make peace, because their governments are against each other, and they do not have a vision for peace. They never had a vision for peace. And by the way, the plan that I'm suggesting, it does not contradict the one state or the two state, even though I don't think these are realistic, but it doesn't contradict. So if someone is in favor of two states, he could still be in favor of the common government. It doesn't contradict it. And 20% could mean 4 million people voting. And 40 million people, 4 million people voting. And that could be a huge statement. It gives legitimacy. It could bring tremendous amount of resources from all over the world. And it could be a game changer, because the governments of the world, the Israeli government, the Palestinian government, will have to pay attention. You cannot have 4 million voting and the governments of the world, the Israeli government, the Palestinian, not paying attention to it. And they will have to participate, because the people of Israel and Palestine are offering a real formula, a democracy, a secular democracy that does not take away an inch from the interest of the Palestinians or the interest of the Israelis. It does not take away iota of their interest. They could still negotiate between themselves. Hell, they could still even fight between themselves. Hopefully not. But whatever the vision of the Israeli government, whatever the vision of the Palestinian government, it doesn't take it away. It just creates a formula for peace that neither the Israeli nor the Palestinian government would be able to respond to. So I hope that it's clear. I hope you join in the next simulation. My name is Joseph Avesar. My first name is spelled Josef. My last name is spelled Avesar. So you could join the simulation. I'll send you an invitation. if you send me an email to josephavasar@ipconfederation.org. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you in the next simulation. Thank you. Bye-bye.